FM News Talk 97.1. On-demand audio.
To help meet the challenges of our time, I'm proud to announce my choice for two key members of my national security team. Chuck Hagel for Secretary of Defense and John Brennan for Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Chuck Hagel is the leader that our troops deserve. He is an American patriot. He enlisted in the Army and volunteered for Vietnam.
The president's press conference
as a young private
discussing Chuck Hagel and John Brennan, which I think Brennan is a horrible choice. And for this, of course, our foreign policy expert, Stephen Yates, is he's an expert with D.C. International Advisory, former advisor to former VP Dick Cheney, and he's on with us every week. So kindly, Happy New Year to you, Stephen.
Happy 2013 to you, Dana.
I have to get your opinion first on John Brennan. This seems to me kind of a disastrous pick. I mean, this was the guy who he doesn't think that there's any sort of connection between extremism and Islam. He failed everyone where it concerned the Christmas Day bomber. I could give a number of reasons where a number of examples of him falling down on the job. He tried for a CIA director before. It didn't work out because of objections. And now it looks as though he may actually squeak by with this. What do you make of this pick?
Well, I agree with everything you just said. It's an extremely controversial nomination. It's not one people have been focused on because of the distractions that President Obama put forward on Susan Rice and now with Chuck Hagel. But this is actually very, very important. On the one hand, John Brennan gets credit from some quarters for continuing Bush administration war on terror policies. But in many, many ways, he's exactly as you described. He's someone who has lied about the nature of our enemy to the detriment of our people deployed. Very likely, along with Valerie Jarrett, were the ones scripting Susan Rice and the president post-Benghazi. This is a person who is basically not made Americans safer. Just try to convince them that if you knock off a few al-Qaeda people one by one, that's all we need to do.
Right. And this is the guy, too, especially when we've been having this discussion about Benghazi. I mean, he was the chief of counterterrorism, advisor to the president. He's, one of the deputies with the Homeland Security and counterterrorism. Benghazi happened on his watch. I would hope that comes up in discussion over his nomination. It
certainly should, and it's definitely relevant. And it really going to have to rely on our stalwart members of the Senate who maybe are beginning to wake up after taking a bit of a drubbing in negotiations on fiscal cliff. But really, this is very, very serious in terms of our national security posture. Really, these two appointments, together with John Kerry being put forward to the Senate, or to the Secretary of State position, tilts the national security table really very far to the left, away from sanctions, away from any kind of a strong move to reshape things in the Middle East, and really opens the door to exactly what for the president's policy in the Middle East.
And this, especially this little trio here that the president is nominating, and I know we're going to see a flurry of nominations in the coming weeks, but here we have Brennan, who we just discussed, and this is the guy who thinks that we should reach out to the moderate elements of Hezbollah. John Kerry, who John Kerry, and then Chuck Hagel as well, who is really kind of proven himself with his remarks and some of his positions to not be any sort of friend towards Israel. It kind of makes me wonder what the face of America's national security is going to look like going forward. What are your if the three are successfully confirmed, how is this going to play out for the next 4 years?
Well, I think that the president is feeling his oats coming off of re-election. Doesn't seem to think there will be any meaningful opposition put forward in the Senate. And I think he meant what he said, that we are getting the appointees that he thinks the country and our men and women in service deserve. Now, that I take differently than the president intended. I take that as an insult to our troops, because there is exactly nothing in Chuck Hagel's background that qualifies him for this job. And if really all you had to do was enlist in the military, there are literally millions and millions of equally qualified men and women to serve in the job. Really, he has been wrong on every major national security question of the last decade. He has been for negotiations with the Iranian thugs. He has opposed sanctions in principle. He has sided with the Palestinians against the Israelis in almost every negotiation of the last decade. And so he's been wrong on policy, and he's not really done anything to distinguish himself on military affairs to say where he would go. The only thing we can be sure of is he would do what the president wants in trying to cut back on the Pentagon budget. He has a mandate to adjust the military to the demands of the new realities that we live in. President hasn't exactly spelled out what those exactly are. But I think it spelled out a lot of uncertainty, weakness abroad, retreat to within our borders to conduct what I think is the president's first priority, revolution at home.
And it's scary indeed. Is it true what I've read that Brennan, going back to John Brennan, he was one of the individuals or the individual that essentially stopped the capture of bin Laden in 1998?
I don't recall exactly where he was in 1998. He was a part of that team. And, of course, Michael Scheuer is the one who has been most outspoken on his disgust about the Clinton administration having multiple opportunities to go after him during that period. Brennan comes out of that team. I just don't recall whether he had a prominent leadership role in making that call.
I can only imagine the sort of message that this sends to the Middle East. I mean, during this press conference, I thought it was somewhat laughable when here it was said that Al Qaeda had been decimated, and I don't recall them being decimated. I mean, from the latest headlines, they're trying to establish their own little sub-country in Western Africa. I don't recall Al Qaeda ever being decimated, but that seems to be the view held by Hagel and Brennan during this press conference that the president gave just an hour or so earlier. I mean, how do you respond to that? That scares me.
It scares me, too, because effectively this is the tactic of politburos of the past, where you state things that are verifiably false over and over from a position of authority until people relent and accept it as if it's true, even though their eyes can tell them differently. We know from just verifiable fact that Islamism is on the rise in the broader Middle East, that the region is less stable, less safe, not just for our troops and our interests, but also for our allies and the world generally. This is just verifiable, observable fact. What the president and what I consider to be his Politburo minions are saying over and over is a lie, that somehow our enemy is not this broader movement of Islamism. It is Al-Qaeda and a few guys on a hit list, that Brennan, to toughen up his credentials, is in favor of murdering some of those people, but not facing a real broad threat to our security.
Now, while I believe Brennan is getting pushback from the left, I think he's going to squeak through because everyone's going to be focusing on Chuck Hagel. And it seems, and Chuck Hagel, it's interesting that the president selected someone who's actually getting bipartisan pushback. That strikes me as odd, but maybe this was part of the strategy to get someone like Brennan in office.
It could be. It also could just be that the president and his team are so myopic and arrogant that they don't notice that there's a problem with this pick. Chuck Hagel is a former senator and, in my book, a former Republican. He was one of the most vocal anti-Republicans for most of his second term in office. I think most of his Republican caucus colleagues were happy to have him leave the Senate, and there's not going to be any happy reunion when he goes back for consultations on the Hill. And on the Democratic side, Hagel also has said and done a number of controversial things that at least make them have to hold their nose as they support the president's pick, and I wonder how much support he'll really get. Right. I think he will receive the fewest votes of any successful Secretary of Defense in the history of the office.
And here we have John Kerry as well. What do you think the likelihood is of John Kerry being confirmed? He seems to me, and granted, I'm completely biased against his ideology and his platform, but someone that he just seems to be a very reckless choice. Who would be the plan B for Kerry, and what's the likelihood of him being confirmed in your estimation?
Well, just because he is a current member of the Senate, and there is sort of a fraternal affinity for giving a break to those who are current members, I would say that it's very high probability he gets confirmed, maybe near 100%.
Oh, wow.
And of the three positions, frankly, I think it's a wonderful job for someone to be the Secretary of State, but it's the one in which he could do the least damage. If he had put forward as the Secretary of Defense, I'd be very worried about his work ethic, his ideology, and where things would go. I have a lot of concerns about Hagel in that regard, too. But putting either of these gentlemen in Foggy Bottom is frankly where they can do the least damage.
Oh, goodness. I wish that there was a better plan B going forward with this. I wish that we could get some very good, but, elections have consequences, though, so we have to deal with the hand that we've got. Oh, Stephen, I'm going to be anxiously watching how this all plays out.
Absolutely. It's going to go on for some weeks, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Stephen Yates, D.C. International Advisory, DCAdvisory.org. Always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for your expertise. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you.
Take care.